we thought we could tackle today, Rich, the child protection social worker role.
Yeah.
Which is a big one and feels like a natural start in many ways. You've set out some myths as you see them, some myths in the child protection system, in the child protection role. Well, I mean, what are you on about here? You say, you write that one of the most common myths is that social workers can keep children safe and happy.
Yeah. So
why is that a myth?
I know it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, doesn't it? And
yes.
This is how a lot of social workers introduce themselves to children, actually, when they say, when they're trying to explain their role. And you know, keeping children safe is definitely like a worthy and desirable goal. But I just feel like even in the most privileged of circumstances, children aren't provided with safety or complete happiness. Most children are endangered at some point. And like a child who isn't allowed to take age appropriate risks, to fall over, to make mistakes, is probably going to grow up disturbed by the lack of autonomy and intrusive parenting that's required to ensure that kind of level of safety. And so I think the goal of child protection is to protect children from undue harm. And that, to me, is a much more modest, achievable, and realistic goal. And it basically encourages us to accept that as a child protection social worker, you can never eradicate risk. Instead, a social worker can work with a family to reduce the risks sufficiently enough to remove the need for statutory social work. And so I just think that's a much more attainable, realistic goal. And I think if you take it on board, will affect how you work with the family, because instead of trying to fix everything, you're just trying to fix some of the key concerns, the key issues, or at least alleviate them to such a degree that statutory involvement isn't necessary.
So this isn't a provocative statement in order to sell books, Rich. This myth that social workers can keep children safe and happy, that does make sense to me, and I also know what you mean, and I have heard that. I have said that myself, probably that is the reason, because I guess you're trying to communicate, particularly with children, you know, what social work is, and it's a complex role, it's a complex profession, it's a complex system. How do you explain that undue harm? That does make sense to me, listening to you as a fellow professional. How do you explain that to children? How do you explain that to families in the moment?
Well, that's a really good question. I think in terms of working with children, the way I introduce myself is to say something like, you know, my name's Rich Devine, I'm a social worker. Do you know what a social worker is? So that I can understand the reference point that they have for who I am and what I represent. And then I'll say something like, you know, I'm a children's social worker, so I only work with, you know, families where there's children involved. And social workers, we don't work with all children, we only work with some children. And we only work with some children when there might be some worries. And so that's probably, and then I would say, do you know what those worries are? And they may or may not volunteer information. And then depending on their answer, I might say something more specific about what the concerns are. Yeah. So I don't necessarily go into describing, you know, that our job is to keep you safe and to keep you happy. I just try and stay in the description about understanding their lived experiences and some of the worries.
Yeah. Oh, to put it in context. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you also say, Rich, so this is myth number 2, how social workers often try to change parents. Yeah. But you say what are you saying? You're not there to change. You're not there to change things. Aren't social workers change agents? Isn't that fundamental to the role, Rich? What are you on about?
Well, we are there to support parents make change. But I suppose for me, and maybe some social workers realise this sooner than I did, but like I thought it was my job to make parents change, and that's not the same as. And what happens when I believe that is that then I would have a lot of frustrating conversations where I was trying to tell parents what their problem is, what they needed to do and how they could go about fixing it. And that often just generated a lot of resistance and conflict in the relationship. And so I think there's ways that we can have conversations with parents that increase the probability of change. But I think that's very different from thinking that we can make parents change. I think there's two things that we can do. One is we can have conversations that facilitate their own desire to change, but there's only so far that we can go with that conversation. And then secondly, we can be clear about what are the consequences from children's social care's point of view should change not occur. And I think part of this idea around not being able to make parents change is related to this idea that we can function as quasi-therapists to bring about change. And I think that's probably challenging in at least two ways. Firstly, like a lot of the parents that we work with are incredibly fearful of social work involvement, or they don't believe that they don't have a problem. And you can't offer therapy to someone who hasn't asked or accepted that they have a problem. And then secondly, as child protection social workers, we don't really have the time. Like in my experience, when I was visiting children who were on a child protection plan, I was visiting once a fortnight, and during that time, I had to speak to the children, I had to speak to the parents, raise any recent concerns, review the home conditions. So if you imagine a social worker going around to the house, say 30 minutes a fortnight, that's the amount of time that a social worker has to influence someone's thinking, their way of dealing with feelings, their patterns of behavior, addiction and relationships. And if you add up, like, because I've done the maths on this, like if you add up 20 minutes a fortnight, it's 40 minutes a month, which is 8 hours a year. So that's 8 hours out of a total of 8,760 hours in a year. That's, in percentage terms, that's 0.1%. And so what that means is 99.9% of the time, a parent is influenced by other relationships, life circumstances, and other factors. Now, you could double, triple, or even quadruple the amount of time that social workers spend with a family. I still think the overall effect remains very small. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that we are, as social workers, therapeutic agents of change. And that's just completely unrealistic and unattainable when we have such little time. And when there's that underlying fear that's embedded within the relationship because we're a representative of a statutory organisation.
I think that's really interesting. I think we get a sense here of really the real interesting ideas here in the book, Rich. And you say that, was there a moment, I know there's lots of tangible examples, and one of the things that served the book and brought it into being is the fact that you had a diary, didn't you? You kept a diary during your time as child protection social worker. And I can see in reading the book that you bring through lots of real examples and memories and reflections from practice. I think that's a really wonderful part of reading the book for me. Third myth that you offer in this chapter is about helping families isn't always possible.
Yeah.
What,
I'm speaking about these ideas, they're quite hard to defend, aren't they? We're not here to help.
Defend them.
We can't help you change. And we can't keep kids safe and happy. So this is an idea that I learned from Donald Forrester, or at least I knew this to be true from my experience, and then Forrester articulated it in a way that made me make sense of it. And basically, helping families is not necessarily our role, although it can be a byproduct of the legislative role that we play. So, for example, like when I've been involved in a child being removed from their parents, it can't be said there that really I'm helping the family or the parents, because all of the parents I worked with obviously find the removal of their child extremely distressing and traumatizing. And often the children are traumatized by it as well, even though it might be necessary in order to ensure their safety and well-being. That's one of the paradoxes of removing children, is that the intention of the professional is to promote safety. The experience sometimes by the child is the opposite. It feels like one of the most distressing, traumatizing events of their life. And so if I measured success based on whether I helped a family in inverted commas, then in many instances I just feel like I would feel like a catastrophic failure. And so I think there's a way to think about the role of child protection social work that's based less on the outcome and more on the process. And one of the things that Forrester points out, which I thought was quite interesting, is he likens the role to he likens the social work role to one of a judge, because the judge isn't evaluated on the outcome of a court case, but on whether he handled it fairly. Like, did the judge use the law judiciously? Did they review the suspect, review the available evidence with rigor? Did they show balance and thoughtfulness? And so I think that's the kind of outcome to aspire in child protection is, are we treating the parents and the children with compassion and kindness and dignity? Have we applied the law proportionately? And have we, most importantly, maximised the probability that the chance can make that the parent can make the necessary changes?
There's a binary in politics or political philosophy that is equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. And equality of opportunity is like, well, we can be meritocratic in providing a path for that is open to anybody to achieve, to attain certain resources, to live a good life. And then there's equality of outcome, which is being intensely interested in like where everybody's at, that everybody is safe, that everybody has what they need, that we try to eradicate poverty and deprivation as much as possible. The worry with what you're saying is that we're not interested enough as social workers in the outcomes and the lived experience of people in community. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think maybe we should try and avoid the dichotomy there, in the sense that I do think there's an element where if you focus on the process, you do have the best chance of achieving the best outcomes. In terms of, like, much of what we want to do in child protection is to work with children and families in order to maximize the probability that they can remain in their home and not experience undue harm. And so that has to be an outcome that we're all striving for. But then there is also a degree where we have to adhere to our I don't know, statutory role and it need to protect children when the harm is too significant or too severe, not susceptible to change.
There's a poignant question in the book where you ask yourself, should I impose statutory involvement in pursuit of the child against their wishes? Yeah.
I think the really important thing is to avoid, within child protection, is to avoid adopting an ideological position and engage in the tension of the need to support children to remain at home versus the need to protect them should the harm become too significant. And that constant tension is fundamentally what social workers are tasked to do. And I think it requires a lot of skill and thoughtfulness and tenacity. It's an unbelievably challenging tension to hold on to. And I think that's partly, this is what I think social work is about. It's about upholding the rights of parents and of children, and to operate at the place where there's a degree of tension. I really like the writing of Jill Berwick, who's an academic from Berkeley, California. And actually, she's going to be coming on the podcast in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
And she wrote a book called The Impossible Imperative. And she identifies these kind of 6 or 7 core principles that social workers are upholding or adhering to. But these principles are sometimes in conflict or in tension with one another. So she's got this line where she writes, children should have a say in a decision that affects their lives. But what if what they want hurts them? So she writes, children should be safe, but what if their safety is compromised when they live with their family? These are not merely philosophical debates. Child welfare workers live out these conflicts on a daily basis and must regularly favour one principle at the expense of others. And so basically, I think frontline social work is characterized by handling these competing rights and dealing with everything that's required in between them. So, for example, I think we want children to be protected from harm, but we realize the best way to achieve this is by helping the parents change or providing support that offsets the risks. And so, in pursuit of this endeavor, it makes complete sense that we form partnerships with parents and we do everything that we can to try and collaborate with them on about how this can be achieved. And so therefore learning how to work with parents, some of whom don't want to work with us, becomes a really critical element of our work.
Well, Rich, I want to finish off the discussion of the chapter with touching on two areas: relationships and relational ethics, in a sense, and then perhaps your reflections on messiness. Rich, I was interested in how you talk about the relationship being a sacred part of the work. Could you just touch on that? And maybe there's a lovely example at the end of the chapter of a moment where you had a moment of feeling that you were unconditionally accepted by a child that you were working with, and it was a lovely moment. Can you reflect briefly on that?
Yeah, so I think for me, the relationship, although I've in some ways downplayed the significance of the relationship in terms of we have limited time, a lot of parents don't trust us, that compromises our ability to provide a therapeutic change relationship. I still believe the relationship is essential in two ways. One is I really want children and parents to feel that I care about them deeply and personally, even though I have to make decisions that they might not agree with or have difficult conversations with them. I still want them to convey in a profound, almost sacred way, a regard for their humanity. And then secondly, I want to treat children and parents with respect and dignity, irrespective of how they treat me. And this is why what I write about in the chapter is the importance of us establishing our own personal ethics. So I mentioned about upholding rights being one key component of effective child protection. And then I think another key component is upholding our ethics.
Yeah. Well,
and at the end of the book, there's a little story that I write about.
It's a lovely story. I mean, maybe we should just say to people, if you, buy the book for those moments where Rich is reflecting, and it's
We've built it out. It's a really lovely story, but
it is a lovely story. Rich, grateful for undergoing the interrogation on your myths. I think I'd really like if there's someone listening that says, I've got an angle I agree strongly or agree with what Rich is saying, then we really would want to wrangle with this philosophy and this notion of
I'd love that.
Yeah.
This I'd welcome any kind of constructive dialogue about what I've written.
That's magic. Thanks so much, Rich. And we will see you again.
Bye for now.